Good to see everybody here. Good turnout this morning. Okay, so as we recall, on Sundays I have been talking about a text called The 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, which is a piece of text which was included in the 12th Haskell version of the Shobogenzo. So it's not something that Dogen wrote in its entirety, it's something which was picked up and sort of set down into the Shobogenzo. It's mostly a long quote from another text, a text called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen included this thing and then he wrote some commentary after it. On Sundays, I've been taking one gate at a time and talking about that and then opening up, for discussion about that particular gate. So today we are up to gate 39. Gate 39 says, not to quarrel is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it stops angry accusations. So the kanji for this doesn't actually say accusations. It just gives a lot more words for contention and dissension and disagreement, right? So in this case, taking this gate statement apart kind of word by word isn't so helpful. Overall, what this gate is telling us is avoid angry arguments because they simply feed the three poisons of greed, hate, and delusion. So it's just saying don't do it, right? So we've got two things we can consider about this gate. One is what the teachings have to say about anger as one of the three poisons. And the other is what the teachings have to say about how that anger moves into aggression. And of course, there's some practice there around the words we use and how we speak. So let's start with the piece about anger. So we've talked a bit about anger related to other gates, right? So we've talked a bit about this before. Gate 14, when we talked about benevolence, we heard that in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddha says that cultivating loving kindness reverses anger and greed. Also that takes some time. It's not simply that we sort of one day decide we're going to cultivate loving kindness and then all our anger goes away. It takes some time, but that is a way to reverse anger. Gate 15 on compassion, we heard that the opposite of compassion is anger, and that when somebody makes a mistake because of his own suffering, sometimes we take that personally and we lash out and anger can arise. So we can take that approach to the things that help anger to arise for us, or we can recognize suffering and pain in somebody else and try to stop that chain or stop that cycle of perpetuating anger. So it's possible over time to see our anger clearly, to see what's arising and why that's arising, and to redirect that energy into something that's more wholesome. So again here, acceptance is not agreement, compassion is not condoning, right? We need to be careful about that. When we got to gate 19, which was our reflection on suffering, we saw that we can make some course corrections. As our insight deepens, as our practice continues, we recognize that we get hijacked when the universe doesn't do what we expect or doesn't give us the things we want, right? We can sort of get hijacked and something happens there. So what can we do? We can hold our goals kind of loosely. Doesn't mean we don't have direction, doesn't mean we're not aiming at something, but we can hold that loosely so that we can find new ways, more helpful ways around the obstacles that we encounter without getting caught up in anger when our ideas about what should be happening don't match reality, right? So we've already kind of nibbled at the edges of this thing in our previous Sundays together. We've all got some personal experiences of anger. This is not new territory, right? This is not some exotic new thing that we're talking about. But today we get to kind of just take it and look at it carefully. So, of course, our tradition has plenty to say about anger as one of the three poisons. These are the most basic causes of our suffering, right? This is kind of the first place we go off the rails. So in this human condition, we fall prey to greed, anger, and ignorance. So these are things that we definitely need to be aware of and to practice with and to take care with. This is at the basis of a lot of the suffering that arises for us and the suffering that we might perpetuate in the world. So these are central kind of teachings. It seems that anger usually happens when the ego gets challenged. Somehow the small self feels challenged or threatened or is uncomfortable in some way. I want things to be a certain way. That's not how they are. Therefore, my self-concept is threatened in some way. Things are not going the way I think they should go, or the way I expect that they should go. So somehow this small I thinks I deserve things, or I don't deserve certain things in my life. Somehow life isn't fair. I worked hard. Somebody else got the prize, right? I worked hard for that promotion. Somebody else got the promotion. Or I was standing here patiently waiting my turn, waiting in line, and somebody cut in front of me, and went first. My friend promised that she would do X or Y for me, and she changed her mind, or she forgot, or something. Suddenly, right, there's a lot of energy that can arise around that. We go forward expecting certain things to happen. When we don't get what we want or what we expect, that's a bad surprise. Nobody likes that. So sometimes we get angry. Sometimes we get angry at ourselves, right? Because we don't match up with our own ideal expectation about what we should be or who we should be as parents, as marriage partners, as practitioners, as employees, as whatever we're attaching our identity to at the moment. We get angry at ourselves for that, right? So, anger can show up in so many forms. Sometimes we can have a sort of a preemptive anger, I think. I'm feeling insecure, so I'm going to get angry at you first before you realize how inadequate I truly am. Right? It's all based on our self-concept. I'm going to make my feelings your fault in some way. So that's, in a backwards way, angry energy can feel good, right? Because it's really powerful. If I'm angry, I must be right or worthy, as an individual, or, I'm justified in the way I feel. Or if I'm angry, I'm scary and powerful to you, and I'm in control in some way, right? I'm going to intimidate you. So it really can feel kind of good to have this anger, because it feels like we're validating ourselves. So anger can come up very quickly, and it can feel like it's not something that's coming from us. It can feel like something we're not creating, and that we're not in control of it. It's something that happens to us. Somehow the universe hands us this tsunami, a very strong feeling, which is not our fault, right? You stub your toe, you cut your finger, it hurts right now. It's like suddenly there's pain. Suddenly we attach some suffering to that. You get passed over for the promotion, or you break that new tool the first time you use it, and it hurts right now. Suddenly something arises. So that's why we need practice, right? It's so that we become intimate with ourselves. So intimate with ourselves that we see what's happening when we stub the toe, when we break the tool, when we get disregarded, because it happens so quickly. Suddenly we're in the midst of it, and it can be hard to see what's actually happening for us. When those feelings of anger come up, what's really going on? We really need to become intimate with ourselves in a particular way in order to see that, to recognize the patterns, to see what's underneath them. Here's that thing again, right? Because it's easier and in some ways less painful not to pay attention to that and to push it somewhere else. So we can certainly use anger to build our own self-image. I have a right to be angry because of what he or she did or said or something. Well, that's just an idea. There's no cosmic scorecard that says, me 1, universe 0. Something happened to me, therefore I get to feel like such and so. That's not to say those feelings are not real, but where are they actually coming from? And are they something which is imposed on me or handed to me, or do I have some part to play in how that arises? So in my days as a government employee, I worked in the visual communications unit, a very large agency. We had several thousand employees. One of the program managers ran into trouble one day with an important presentation he was giving. And one of the things the empire that I had carved out for myself was presentation coaching and helping people make effective slides and speak effectively and do all of that. So he ran into trouble with some equipment when he was doing a very important presentation. Because I frequently served as a resource for people giving presentations, Although I was not in the middle of this particular problem, and this particular problem was not of my making, and I was not responsible for it, nonetheless, I got the brunt of this guy's anger. He was pretty upset that this has not gone well. One of my coworkers became angry on my behalf and said, what he said to you was inappropriate, he owes you an apology. And I said, no, actually, it's okay, because that wasn't about me. You know, it was coming at me. He was venting. He was angry. But I knew that wasn't actually about me. That was about him, you know, being upset about an expectation. You know, he had an expectation, and the expectation didn't get met. I said, actually, you know, that's okay. He was unskillful, no question. He was expressing his frustration. He wasn't actually attacking me personally. I could see that if I held on to some kind of personal grievance about this thing, not only was I giving it legs, it was going to perpetuate, but it actually wasn't going to help anybody. You know, it's like, what good was it really going to do if I got angry back at him? It wasn't going to solve anything. It certainly wasn't going to enhance our relationship in any way. It's like, just open the hand. You know, just kind of let that one go by. If there's a pattern of abusive behavior, you know, that's something else. This was a guy simply got angry. So, you know, no good was going to come of it. How is it going to help? So it's important for us to understand that our tradition, you know, the Buddha and our ancestors, are not asking us to ignore our anger or suppress our anger or pretend somehow that it's not there. The human condition is such, this is one of the three poisons. So we're going to get angry, right? You know, we're baby bodhisattvas, as Hojo-san sometimes says. We're baby bodhisattvas. We're still working on stuff. We're still working on practice. We're still working on seeing clearly and manifesting our Buddha nature as clearly as we can. So anger is going to be in the mix. It's kind of not avoidable. We're going to have anger. Once it arises, we have to deal with it. So that means we have to fully enter into it. And there are ways that we choose not to fully enter into it. So acting it out is one way to not enter into it. Squashing it down is another way not to enter into it. Those are both ways that we just use to avoid fully feeling what's going on, fully paying attention to what's going on. So if I act out my anger, I turn it around. I turn it on you. You know, I turn my focus to you. I ignore what's actually happening here, and I make you responsible for how I feel. And, you know, when we say it that way, we just think that makes no sense, right? But we've all done that, right? You know, you get angry and you turn that on somebody. Well, acting it out, turning that into aggression and acting it out is a really good way to not take responsibility in terms of not seeing clearly what's happening here. Squashing it down means I pretend I really don't have any anger. Everything's really okay. Maybe somehow in our lives we were taught that that was the appropriate response to our anger. Maybe we were afraid of feeling our anger. Of course, we might be afraid of breaking relationships by acknowledging that we have some anger. So again, I get to ignore what's actually happening with me. So, you know, these are natural human responses to our anger. This is not about beating ourselves up for those things, but we do, as practitioners, get to look carefully at what's going on and what am I doing with that, right? So it's one thing for anger to arise, and then what are we doing on that basis? What are we doing with that? So maybe instead we say to ourselves, okay, the reality is I'm angry. Something happened. It wasn't something I liked. It wasn't something I expected. And hey, you know, here's anger. You know, now what do? Well, I don't like what's happening. I don't like how I'm feeling. I don't like any of that stuff. So can I ask myself, what's being challenged here? Why is this making me uncomfortable? What about this does not feel okay? Do I need to do something about my anger? Or can I see that it's something that's going to resolve itself? I stubbed my toe. I'm angry. I'm angry at the thing I stubbed my toe on. I'm angry at myself for not paying attention. Okay, that's going to resolve, right? But if there's something going on and I need to take care of that, I need to take care of my anger and what's causing my anger, then how do I do that skillfully? Can I take a breath? Can I pause for a minute and say, okay, what's actually the skillful response here? And we all know that is not easy because anger is quick and our habituated thinking is quick and we respond like right now. So practice is what gives us the chance to make a bit of space. And to say, okay, the reality is here's anger. What's happening? What now? Before we do something that we are going to regret later because it was an unskillful action. So there's a difference between anger and aggression. So anger, we're feeling some anger. Some anger is arising. The aggression is the action we take based on the feeling. So what are we doing with that? How are we turning thought into speech or action? Because we know, body, speech, and mind, the three places we create karma. So how is that chain happening? What's going now? What's happening now? So we need to open up that space between impulse and action, between in a flash, here's anger, and what am I doing, right? So in our practice, can we open up that little bit of space that gives us a chance to choose something, or at least to see what's happening? If we can't choose, if the habituated, response takes over, at least can we open up enough space to investigate what's going on? So Zazen gives us that opportunity, doesn't it, to watch anger arise without being able to get up off the cushion and go pick a fight, right? We've probably all had it happen that in our Zazen, when we've kind of dropped all of our stuff and we're really being intimate with what we're carrying and what's going on, we notice, golly, there's some tension in my body. I'm angry at something that happened, or at something I did, or at something somebody said. That stuff kind of gets clearer for us when we're sitting. Well, the good news about that is we're probably, especially if we're sitting in a zendo with other people, we're probably not getting up off the cushion and picking up the phone and making that angry phone call, right? We don't have to create additional karma around that. We can sit with that. And the thing that becomes clear, which is a blinding flash of the obvious in some ways, is that anger is not going to hurt me. I can sit here and feel that anger, but it's not going to injure me. I'm uncomfortable. I don't like it, but it's not going to hurt me. It's kind of not a life-threatening situation that I'm sitting here feeling angry. And I think a lot of the times we immediately want to divert that. We want to do something with that because we want to get rid of it, right? I mean, so much of our practice is about integration. There are parts of ourselves in our experience that we just don't want to have there, and anger can be one of those things. So our practice is about we fully enter into this moment in its entirety and everything that means, and that takes some courage, there's no question. But sitting on the cushion, sitting in Zazen, getting clear about the entirety of our experience, we can say, there's some anger here. I don't like it, but I'm not going to get up in this moment and do anything about it. Therefore, it's safe for me to fully enter into this thing. I'm not going to hurt anybody with this, sitting on a cushion. I can completely enter into it and investigate it in a compassionate way for myself and others, and just say, what's really going on here? That's a really interesting thing to do. That's a really interesting practice. It's not about psychoanalyzing yourself while you're sitting in Zazen, because we know that's not what Zazen is. You might make a mental note, stick it in your pocket. There might be something you follow up with when you get off the cushion. But in the midst of Zazen, can we open the hand of thought? Can we not judge the anger? Can we not judge ourselves for feeling the anger? Can we not write a story about the person who we think made us angry? Can we simply be in the midst of the complete reality of what's going on? That is not easy, right? But it is one way we can work with anger. We do have to be careful not to sit there for 50 minutes and ruminate on the anger, right? Investigating it, being in the middle of it, does not mean we're feeding it. It doesn't mean we're writing a story about it, because it would be really easy to get on the train with that anger and ride it out of town. I'm going to spend 50 minutes kind of stewing in my anger about what happened or what I said or what she did, or, right? That's not what we're talking about here. Being in the midst of it is not, the same as I'm engaging with it and writing a story. And that's a kind of a subtle difference. We have to kind of pay attention about that. What we don't want to have happen is we sit for 50 minutes with our anger, and as soon as the bell rings, we boil over and we get up and run out of the zendo and do some unskillful thing because we've kind of fed the flames, right? That's not what we're suggesting we do with our anger. So, looking carefully at it doesn't mean clinging to it. Doesn't mean grabbing it, holding on to it, doing something with it. We're simply being with it and watching it come and go. We're not making anything out of it. So let's do what we can, right, to create enough space within ourselves, within our Zazen, within our daily lives, to see that anger before it becomes aggression. So before the thoughts and the feelings become action, speech or action, let's see what's arising. Before we start the quarrel that this gate is talking about. So Dogen Zenji had some useful stuff to say about this whole thing in the Shobogenzo Zuimonki. So this passage is a bit long, but I think it's helpful. So this is Hojo-san's translation of what Dogen had to say in this part of the Zuimonki. So once, Zen Master Shinjo Kokubun told his students, "In former times, I practiced together with Seppo." Seppo is one of his brothers. Once Seppo was discussing the Dharma loudly with another student in the monk's dormitory. Eventually, they began to argue, using harsh words, and in the end wound up quarreling with each other. After the argument was over, Seppo said to me, "You and I are close friends, practicing together with one mind. Our friendship is not shallow. Why didn't you help me when I was arguing with that man?" At the time, I could do nothing but feel small, folding my hands and bowing my head. Later, Seppo became an eminent master, and I too am now an abbot. What I thought at the time was that Seppo's discussion of the Dharma was ultimately meaningless. Needless to say, quarreling was wrong. Since I thought it was useless to fight, I kept silent. So this is Dogen telling the story of what Shinjo said. Then he goes on to make a comment. Students of the way, you also should consider this thoroughly. As long as you aspire to make diligent effort in learning the way, you must be careful with your time. When do you have time to argue with others? Ultimately, it brings about no benefits to you or to others. This is so even in the case of arguing about the Dharma, much more about worldly affairs. Even though the power of a wise man is stronger than that of an ox, he does not fight with the ox. Even if you think that you understand the Dharma more deeply than others, do not argue, criticize, or try to defeat them. If there is a sincere student who asks you about the Dharma, you should not begrudge telling him about it. You should explain it to him. However, even in such a case, before responding, wait until you have been asked 3 times. Neither speak too much, nor talk about meaningless matters. After reading these words of Shinjo, I thought that I myself had this fault, and that he was admonishing me. I have subsequently never argued about the Dharma with others. So, we can go back and look at all of Dogen's writings and say, well, did he actually argue about the Dharma with others? We know sometimes he gets a bit contentious. But for the purposes of this story, he's saying, here's what Shinjo's experience was, and I'm reflecting on this all this time later and thinking, is there something there I need to pay attention to? So this is how Dogen learned to practice with this impulse to be quarrelsome. So interestingly, his conclusion is, it's a waste of your time. I mean, regardless of, everything else potentially about angry quarreling, it's like, it's a waste of your time. You got better things to do, like actually practicing. Instead of spending your time, arguing with people about the Dharma, do something more constructive, because time is fleeting. The human life is finite, so don't spend your time on that. When I read this, it reminded me of a saying, maybe you've heard this saying, never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. That's what kind of came up for me. I feel like Dogen here is saying, don't quarrel with folks because it wastes their time and it makes people cranky. So what's the good of that? What good outcome can come of that, right? So quarreling is what happens when we forget about interconnectedness, right? We forget about non-separation in a big way. There's something in my world that I don't like. I want to get rid of it, therefore I wave my arms and make a lot of loud roaring noises, and somehow that's going to fix the problem. Somehow that's going to separate me from this thing in my life, that I don't like. So quarreling comes from being self-involved. We've forgotten the big picture. We've forgotten the big interconnectedness. We're really focused on self, small self, and what's going on with small self. When we're self-involved, it's very difficult to see the world from anybody else's point of view. So if I'm quarreling with somebody, I'm pretty caught up in my own stuff, and it's very difficult for me to take a breath and step back and say, well, now wait a minute. Do I understand this person's point of view, or am I just projecting a lot of stuff? Am I actually listening? Is this a constructive conversation, or am I just being quarrelsome? It's hard to step back. So we have to be able to loosen our grip on our own ideas and make enough space that somebody else's idea, somebody else's point of view can actually get in. Doesn't mean we roll over and say, oh, I'm wrong, you're right, if that's not the case, but at least we need the spaciousness to be able to take in what somebody else is saying. I'm sure it's happened to you. It certainly happened to me. If I stop and listen to the person, I go, oh, wait a minute. We're actually kind of agreeing here, you know. We're maybe agreeing on the goal, and the way to get to the goal we don't agree about, but there's some underlying commonality here, and if I don't allow enough space for that, you know, we can't see that commonality. So again, this doesn't mean that we become doormats. This doesn't mean we become wishy-washy. It doesn't mean we don't stand for something. You know, we've all got some deeply held values, and that's fine. It's not that we shouldn't stand for something. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have opinions. Doesn't mean we shouldn't reach conclusions for ourselves about our lives and what we're seeing and all of that stuff. So it's not about that. It means we don't get so trapped up in our own perceptions, in our own conclusions, in our own worldview, that we can't see beyond that and see that there is the potential for something else, something in addition. There is the potential for my worldview not to be the whole story. You know, I need to put things in context, and I can't do that if I'm only focused here. So Dogen must have run into this dynamic in his own life and in his own Sangha, because elsewhere in the Zui Monkey, another part of the Zui Monkey, he says, even if you were speaking rationally and another person says something unreasonable, it is wrong to defeat him by arguing logically. On the other hand, it is not good to give up hastily saying you are wrong, even though you think that your opinion is reasonable. Neither defeat him nor withdraw saying you are wrong. It is best to just leave the matter alone and stop arguing. If you act as if you have not heard and forget about the matter, he will forget too and will not get angry. This is a very important thing to bear in mind. So according to Dogen, we've got 3 ways to deal with a looming quarrel. We can let our anger boil over into aggression until that becomes an unskillful quarrel. We can roll over and submit and, you know, not offer information even though we think what we have to say is valuable or important, or we know we're right in some way. Or we can open the hand and not engage with the quarrel and let the dust settle and let everybody, you know, calm down until we're in a better position to be able to see beyond the self-clinging and the 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas, until we can see beyond our self-involvement to the rest of the circumstance, right, to the rest of the story, the entirety of that moment. Now, as soon as we talk about quarrels that arise from forgetting about interconnectedness, in this family, somebody usually thinks about the story that Uchiyama retold about the squabbling squashes. Right? That's kind of, it's a famous story in our family, and we kind of want to go there. So he retold, in Opening the Hand of Thought, you may recall, he retold an old story about the squabbling squashes. So in the field, behind the temple, squashes were growing. One day, a quarrel breaks out amongst all of these squashes. They get loud, they get raucous, they start making a lot of noise. They all take sides. This thing kind of escalates. The clergy in the temple comes out, breaks up this quarrel, says, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Breaks up the quarrel, teaches them to do zazen. Says, okay, everybody settle down. We're going to learn to sit. So he teaches them all to, you know, fold their legs. Squashes have legs, I don't know, but he teaches them to fold their legs. You know, take the zazen posture, sit quietly for a minute. You know, they did this until all the squashes kind of calmed down. When the dust had settled, the clergy said, everybody put your hand on your head. Which they do. Again, squashes have hands, I don't know. They put their hands on their heads, and they discover that they are all interconnected because of the vine. They're all on the same vine. They go, wait a minute. What's this? You know, they realize that they're all growing on the same vine. They're all connected to each other, always have been. You know, and they say, well, why are we taking sides and quarreling when we're all living one life together on this vine? So that's a nice story. Right? That's a nice image. That's a nice story. I think it's more helpful for working with a tendency to be quarrelsome than with stopping a quarrel that's looming. I think it would be kind of difficult if somebody's about to argue with you for you to tell the story of the squashes and go, wait a minute, we're connected. Kind of think maybe that's not a teachable moment. But the story is helpful for helping us think about how do we fall into being quarrelsome? How does that arise? So I think we have to come at this thing, this gate, this Dharma gate, from 2 directions. In the short term, we have to do our best to watch what's happening right now with us and with our circumstances before aggression boils over, before anger boils over into the quarrel. In the long term, we have to dislodge our habit of being quarrelsome, right? So we've got two things we can actually be working on. So in the short term, Dogen says, walk away from the fight. Don't pick up whatever somebody else threw down and, rise up and go into battle. Just walk away from the fight. In the longer term, I think Uchiyama Roshi's story says, remember that all beings are interconnected, and ultimately it doesn't make any sense to argue with yourself, right? If we're all connected, if I am you, and, in the absolute world, there's no separation, then if I pick a quarrel with you, I'm arguing with myself. That kind of doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, does the right hand argue with the left hand? It doesn't make sense. This bit of the universe doesn't need to argue with that bit of the universe. That's not usually the way we see our lives, but if we remember interconnectedness, we can take that approach. And maybe we diffuse or dislodge this habit we might have of being quarrelsome. So interestingly, the English word quarrel usually means a heated disagreement about something which is trivial, so it's not something really critical, and it happens between two people who typically get along just fine. Typically, we have a good relationship, and we're arguing about something which is kind of meaningless, and it gets heated, and it's a heated dispute. And when you look at what that kind of is, you think, that's kind of ridiculous. We totally get why it happens, but we look at it and we go, it kind of doesn't make sense. These are people who are typically friends or coworkers or Sangha mates or married couple, or, typically things are good, and yet some trivial thing happens. Whew, anger arises, and now we're having a heated dispute. So it fits pretty well, I think, with the squash story. It's kind of what's happening with these squashes. Some minor thing happens, ego takes a hit, suddenly we forget that we've been friends with this person for years, or married to this person for years, or working with this person for years, or sitting next to this person in the zendo for years. Suddenly that all kind of goes out the window, and we just think, what's happening? I think it's actually the fact that the person we're quarreling with is somebody we value that makes this so difficult. It's like, it's one thing to argue with a stranger. Somebody, you're in line at the grocery store, somebody you've never seen before cuts in front of you. It's like, okay, there's that. But what if it's an actual quarrel, because a quarrel is with your friend, your Sangha mate, your spouse, your coworker? It's like, that's even harder, right? Because that's a relationship you really value. You don't want to break that relationship. And then there's something between you, and it feels like ickier than ever. Right? I think that's part of what makes this difficult. And also, I think perhaps we're more quick to quarrel in that way because we know that person pretty well in some way. We've been working together, we've been sitting together, we've been living together, whatever it is. We know that person pretty well. We have some expectations about how our relationship is going to be. Most of the time, it's pretty good, or we wouldn't be in the relationship. So we have some expectation that agreement, that care, that compassion, that wisdom is going to be there all the time. And then suddenly something happens. Somebody makes an offhand remark, somebody forgets somebody's birthday, somebody, tips over something in the kitchen. And it's like, oh, that person didn't do what I expected, or did something which I feel is injurious to me. Of all the people in the world, it shouldn't be that guy. Of all the people in the world who are hurting me, it shouldn't be that person. So no wonder that's an expectation that suddenly, that's not what we expected at all. So it hurts even more, right? So those little trivial kind of quarrels really take on a life. Being hurt by somebody we care about is worse than being hurt by somebody we've never met. So kapow, suddenly there's a lot of energy there. I think we've maybe all had that experience. So we forget in that moment that we are connected with our friend or loved one by shared history, shared experience, maybe by blood. All we can see is me. I'm angry. I'm angry at you. Right? That's like our whole world becomes that. And then we say some unskillful things, and now we have a quarrel, which nobody wanted. So in the Vinaya, which is the part of the Pali Canon which talks about the rules and procedures for the Sangha, it says that causing a schism, causing a break, a divide, was a grievous enough offense that you could get kicked out of the Sangha for that. So if you were the person who broke the Sangha, you were done, right? It was really a big deal in a Dharma family, in a Sangha, right? These are people who are, friends who are practicing together. So interestingly, the Buddha said, even in the event of a schism, even that's already there, each side is still supposed to treat the other side with care, with respect, even while there's some investigation happening about, what caused the schism, what caused the quarrel, what caused the break. Even in the midst of that, he says each side is still supposed to take care of the other side because we're still connected, right? It's still not a reason to pick a quarrel or to, use kind of harsh language. So the Buddha even taught about what happens when we see a quarrel and we're trying to figure out whose side we're on. He says we should always be on the side of the Dharma. Well, that sounds easy, right? He's saying which side is acting on behalf of the Dharma. That's not always clear in any kind of disagreement because we want to say I'm right, you're wrong, and it's all based on ego. He says, well, look at who is working for wholesomeness, who's working to, both sides might intend good. Actually, this is why I say it's not always easy to tell. If we disagree about what's the best way to do good in the world, and that's what we're quarreling about, it can be difficult to figure that out, right? So he's saying, do some discernment. Take some care, be skillful. If you need to take a side, figure out who's working for the Dharma. So whether we're one of the quarreling parties or we're somebody who's coming along and kind of seeing what's happening, we still have some responsibility to be careful, to be skillful, and need to pay attention. We can think, I see my friend quarreling with somebody, I of course need to support my friend. But it's saying, well, now take a step back. Who's actually working for the Dharma? So in the case of somebody who is actively sowing dissension with his or her speech, really has some intent to cause harm. This is not kind of an idle quarrel. This is somebody, with intent to cause harm. Our job is to be on the side of ameliorating suffering for the most possible beings, for the largest number of beings. So that's not leaving ourselves out, by the way. We're one of those beings. So it also doesn't leave out the person creating the dissension. How can we ameliorate suffering for as many people as possible, including the people who are quarreling? Might be us, might not be us. So in fact, there's a story in the Pali Canon about the monks in the Sangha who are quarreling about the Dharma. We've got various monks who are specialized in various kinds of teachings, and the day comes, they can't stand it anymore. There's an argument about the Dharma. They're quarreling about the Dharma. It went on and on and on to the break of dawn, and the Buddha tried to mediate this thing. He tried to, resolve this quarrel, find some peaceful way to bring this thing to an end. Monks just kept fighting. He was unsuccessful in resolving this quarrel. Finally, he takes up his robe and he takes his bow and he leaves. He goes off into the forest by himself and he lives quite nicely with the animals. The elephants take care of him and the animals bring him some food, and he has quite a nice kind of little animal sangha, and he's living quite happily out there by himself. The quarrel is still going on. Eventually, the townspeople learn that the Buddha has left the sangha, and they stop giving alms to the monks. Right? He's gone. They're figuring, why are we supporting these quarreling monks? So their source of sustenance, stops coming. Eventually, these monks look around and say, wait a minute, nobody's giving us alms anymore. What's actually going on? What? You mean the Buddha's left? It's like they get a chance to look up from their self-involvement and go, wait a minute, this is a whole thing happening here. So Ananda finally goes to the Buddha, persuades him to come back. The monks eventually go to him and apologize, for the quarrel. They all get to kind of resolve things and they get to live together again. What a great example, I think, of walking away from a fight, right? Not only did the Buddha not get caught up in this thing, which he could have. They're arguing about the Dharma, right? I mean, the man's a Dharma teacher. He could have taken sides and, the thing could have got ugly. He didn't do that, didn't get caught up in it, didn't feed that quarrel with his own ego. And the fact of his leaving was what got the monks to look around and say, wait a minute, there's something happening here which is bigger than us in our quarrel. They realize they're not getting material support anymore. So I think the Buddha did something smart to break the preoccupation of the monks who were quarreling. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a big show of leaving. He didn't say, if you don't stop, I'm leaving. He just kind of disappeared, right? He just walked away. So that all is helpful and interesting. But I think he's also making a comment on the condition of those monks who were arguing. Because at the end of that text, at the end of that sutra, there's a verse, which the Buddha said, according to the sutra. He says, one should associate with the wise, not the foolish. It would be better to live alone. If we cannot find good friends, there is no companionship with the foolish. I mean, I just kind of busted out laughing. For foolish here, we can read ignorant, right? And this is ignorance as one of the three poisons. So this is ignorance, being ignorant of the nature of suffering, how suffering arises, what suffering is about, all the really basic stuff he's been teaching them, starting with the Four Noble Truths. He's saying these people are ignorant. These monks are displaying their ignorance by perpetuating this quarrel, by letting it arise and by perpetuating this quarrel. They're showing the whole world that they're inflexible, that they're caught up in their own ideas, they're being driven by their egos, they're clinging to self, right? I mean, they're kind of displaying this for everybody to see. So it's like kind of, no wonder the alms stopped coming in. These people are not being skillful. So the Buddha says, it's not worth my time to hang out with you people. You're not in any position to engage with me or with anybody else in a skillful way, in some way that's meaningful and mature and useful. Even though you're talking about the Dharma, this is not the way we talk about the Dharma. We don't quarrel about the Dharma. It's just like, later, I'll come back when y'all have grown up. So I think it's really interesting. On the one hand, the leaving, gets their attention, but I think he's also making a comment that says, this is ignorance. This is based in ignorance. So, I mean, he's doing some teaching by not being there. So I think this is a really skillful thing in the midst of a quarrel. I'll come back when you've done some growing up. And of course, eventually he does. So, differences of opinion, normal, healthy human condition. Nobody's saying there shouldn't be differences of opinion or that there will never be differences of opinion. We're never all going to agree on anything. If nothing else, our karmic circumstances are different. We all grew up in different places. We've all experienced different things. We're not the same people. Karmic circumstances say we're not going to agree about everything. This is what it is to be a person, right? To be human. The question is, what do we do with those differences of opinion? Do we attack the other person and create a win-lose? Do I pick a quarrel with you so that I can win? Or do we maintain some equanimity so that we can think clearly and see clearly and leave some possibility for perhaps agreeing to disagree, right? We can agree to disagree and not make that a quarrel. We can share our different opinions and still have respect for each other and not pick a quarrel about that. So having different views is fine and healthy, but what are we doing when those differences become apparent? So, do we maintain a spirit of inquiry and give the other person a chance to explain or to share their own experience? Do we leave enough space for that? Or do we just grab as much territory as possible for ourselves? Right? I'm going to cover as much ground and make myself as large as possible and not give you, a word in edgewise because, I'm defending some kind of territory. So we need to not fall prey, I think, also to the idea that I know you will agree with me once you understand me. That used to be me. I mean, I know that one intimately. If I just explain my view enough, you will agree with me. Well, there's no guarantee. This person could understand completely my point of view and still not agree with me. Right? And if we understand that, then it heads off, the lecturing and the pontificating and all that stuff. It's like, no, this person gets it. That doesn't mean they agree. We can disagree without being harmful to the other person. It has to be okay with me that you fully understand what I'm saying and yet you don't agree with me. That has to be okay with me. Otherwise, we can disagree by, or at the same time, resorting to things like being dismissive, being arrogant, being condescending. Well, she doesn't understand. The reason she doesn't agree is because, I get it and she doesn't get it. What is that but 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas? So, there's so many layers of subtlety around this thing. I'm going to pick a quarrel in order to show that I'm better than you. or to show that I get it in a way you don't get it. So we can disagree without quarreling if we try not to take things personally, and we don't make them personal. We don't attack the other person, and we don't take things personally. If we go into that discussion being really careful not to injure anybody, doesn't mean we roll over, doesn't mean we roll over and play dead, but can I have a conversation without the intent to injure somebody? And injury can mean things like I'm not going to ridicule you or demean you or disregard you or something. Somebody who doesn't agree, one reason to pick a quarrel is to kind of dismiss them, move them to the side, put some distance, create separation. So, instead, can we work for integration? I can understand what you're saying and not agree with you. So handling disagreements without quarreling is a gate of Dharma illumination because it's one way that we show our Buddha nature, our true nature, in an unclouded way. There's not stuff getting in the way. Things are not easy. We don't all agree. There's some suffering there perhaps, but that doesn't mean we can't show our Buddha nature in a pure way, in an unclouded way, without stuff getting in the way. Also, on the other side, it helps us settle down so we can see the true functioning of the Dharma in the world. If I'm caught up in my stuff, I can't look around and see clearly what's happening out here. So I think that Dharma illumination kind of works two ways. We're illuminating the Dharma, we're demonstrating the Dharma, we're manifesting the Dharma by our skillful behavior, and our skillful behavior allows us to keep doing that. So it's a cycle, right? It's a spiral. The truth is that we're interconnected. We can't get away from that. So bickering kind of doesn't serve any purpose. No good can come of that. It feeds a self, which is actually empty. So we're creating, more ideas about self. So all that bickering is feeding something that doesn't need to be fed. Self doesn't need to be fed in that way. If you win the quarrel, you don't really win anything. It's like, what's the good outcome for anybody? Nobody wins. You just feed those three poisons. And I think you just sow the seeds of the next argument. At the end of World War I, Europe was carved up in a particular way that just sowed the seeds. People were unhappy, people were disregarded, sowed the seeds for the next world war, right? So we don't want to be doing that in our lives, because that quarrel, we might think it's come to an end, and then we know there's this lingering resentment, and then it doesn't take much for that thing to leap out again, right? Or if we're squashing down our anger, it doesn't take much for that to leak out in some other sideways, unskillful way, right? So we have to be careful about even how we end those quarrels. Is there residue? Or do we really understand what's happening? So, yes, we should offer our insights. We should offer our points of view in the conversation. Yes, we should skillfully correct somebody if and when that's appropriate and if that's helpful. Yes, we need to stand our ground when that's necessary. But can we do that and do no harm? Let me stop there. My goodness. Let me stop there so that others can ask, say, whatever you'd like to say about this Dharma gate, about quarreling, or whatever is bubbling in your practice. What would folks like to say? Nobody's got a quarrel today.
Well, I have a question.
Please.
Yeah, so this has to do with how other people may be expecting or conditioned to receive anger. So I find that sometimes I see the anger arising about a certain issue, and I know that, like, if I yell at somebody, it's not going to help and so on. But on the other hand, if I kind of make a constructive criticism, let's call it, people don't seem to hear that. It's like they need to hear the anger in order to hear the message in some way. And so I end up sometimes like expressing it because I feel like if I don't do that, they don't hear it. And they just say, oh, well, it's not a big deal because he's not angry. So just let it go. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's some real subtlety there. And this is not an uncommon question. It arises in various permutations in our practice. There's a difference between anger, which is driven by small self, and something we might call anger. I would disagree that it's actually anger, which we feel for on behalf of other beings. We see injustice in the world and we get angry about it. There are those who would say that's anger. I kind of don't think that's anger. I think we are looking around with some wisdom and saying there's something here which needs to change. I feel very strongly that it needs to change, but this is, in its pure form, this is not anger which is driven by my ego. In the human condition, I don't think there's anybody that can actually do that. I think there's always some little bit of self in there. It's because we're baby bodhisattvas, right? It's because our vows have no end. It's because our practice has no end. So I think there's a difference between speaking loudly without ego and getting angry. We all know, our teachers even sometimes, will holler at it. I mean, look at people like Kodo Sawaki. It's like, man, they want to get your attention. They're not doing that because they feel personally injured. They're doing that on your behalf to get your attention. It looks like anger, but if you could get in there and see, supposedly in an enlightened being, if Buddha was doing this, he's being loud and he's being forceful, and it might look like anger, but it's not coming from a place of personal injury, and that's kind of the difference. I think you're not wrong when you say we as humans in particular cultures and times are conditioned to receive that behavior and interpret it in a particular way. So we receive what Buddha's doing and go, Buddha's angry at me. I think part of the skillfulness of this and why it's so difficult is that we have to know when to speak. When we can be received and how we're being received and how to do that in a skillful way. And it's not always obvious and it's not always easy, and sometimes we make mistakes. Which is why we have vow and repentance. We're vowing to do the most skillful thing we can do in that moment, and then we know we can't predict the outcome. It might be that we have to go back and do something else. Communicate differently, get somebody's attention differently. If we've broken the relationship, we might have to have a conversation about that, right? So things change slowly. And I think there is an element of this about what is our habituated behavior. So if somehow, I'm not saying this is you because I don't know you well enough. I'm going to make a story. If somehow someone is raised in a circumstance or lived for a long time in a circumstance where the only way that person ever gets anybody's attention is to be loud and angry and be an angry bear and roar and wave your arms. That's how that person has learned to behave. Somehow that means, I'm right and I get everybody's attention. So to change that kind of habituated behavior, my goodness, that takes a long time. And if everyone around that person is conditioned in that way to say, well, that means a certain thing, then we have to change that expectation, right? So that's not easy. That's why practice doesn't end. So I think we have to be careful. Anyway, the upshot of that is I think we have to be careful about what is anger that's driven by an injured ego and what is powerful wisdom aimed at making change for beings. Because I don't think those are the same things. And these are the questions we run into in things like engaged Buddhism, or if we're trying to do some kind of community engagement as practitioners. Golly, somebody's, dumping point source pollution into the river and, they shouldn't be doing that. I'm angry about that. Well, yeah, there's a little bit of ego. And then there's also, I want to make a change for beings. And I think we have to distinguish. They're not separate, but we have to distinguish. Do you want to follow up on any of that? Or is that okay for now?
Well, yeah, I just thank you for the response. I think that clears some things up. Just the particular context I'm thinking about, there's several, but one is with children, right? Where it's just like, well, I told you to clean up this stuff on the table 13 times. If I don't escalate to expression of anger, they're like, yeah, whatever.
Okay. Well, children is kind of a whole other thing. And I got to say, I'm not a parent, and some of you are. And you may have a better answer than me, and maybe that's a coffee time, outside of here, like parents group, right? I do know that it's certainly possible to condition kids to, unless mom and dad are really angry, I don't need to pay attention. So now maybe it's time to step back and say, okay, given the age of the children and whatever their psychological development is at that particular age, is like, how do I get their attention And I have to say, that's not my area of expertise, and I'm not going to I'm not going to go there because I know my limits, right? But I think you're not wrong when you say there are times where unless something gets escalated, we don't pay attention. And in fact, when we look at society as a whole, that's why protests happen, right? That's how change gets made, because politicians, decision makers, want to de-escalate that stuff. It's like we're all just yelling louder and louder until we get somebody's attention. We all know what that feels like, So it is part of the human condition. We want to get the attention. We can get attention without being angry, or without going from that place. So your particular question with the parenting, I can't help you with, but in general, there's a distinction, I think, to be made. Is that enough for now?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Other people who'd like to say something or ask something? Doju, you were laughing, so what have you got to say?
Kind of unrelated. So it seems like in the early tradition that kind of cultivating ethics was seen as sort of a prerequisite to undertaking a meditative practice. Mm-hmm. And of course, in our tradition, that's not really a thing. So I'm just sort of curious, like, in my own experience, I feel like sometimes, when I sit, I'll get caught up with something that's kind of driven by anger, as you sort of touched on. And I've also practiced with some people who are just, clearly very like angry people, and, will get up from a period of zazen and like yell at the person next to them for breathing too loudly or something like that. I've seen stuff like that happen. So I'm just kind of curious what you think about this relationship between ethics as sort of, being cultivated through our zazen, or if it's something that, ideally should be focused on separately or before.
I think in our tradition, we would say they arise together. When we study the precepts, one of the teachings around that is the precepts are a manifestation, or they're a manifestation of how we live when we see clearly. When we have wisdom and compassion and we see clearly what's happening, we naturally live in the way described by precept. So we can let go of the handrails. Nobody has to provide guidelines. We just live that way. That sounds nice. But also, it happens the other way, where we need to establish wholesomeness and ethical living in order to settle, so that we can practice, so that our zazen is clear, and it is easier, I don't know, for us to see clearly, to drop our stuff, to open the hand, to see what's going on with self. So these two things are really interconnected, and I see you, Hoshin. These things are really like interconnected. So it's like one is a manifestation and the other one is how we help to cultivate that. So they really arise together. So probably everyone has had some experience of sitting down in zazen and suddenly being hit by a tsunami of emotion. And we feel angry. I've seen people start laughing uncontrollably. I certainly, hours weeping on the cushion. And probably you guys too, right? I mean, suddenly we drop our defenses, because we kind of want to wall that stuff off. We don't want to feel that stuff. We don't want to be in the middle of that stuff. And yet we sit zazen, we open the hand, and suddenly, it's there. It's like maybe we knew it was there, and maybe we didn't know it was there. Suddenly here we are. And so it might be anger. And in the midst of zazen, we're sitting 50 minutes, with this boiling anger. And then, as Doju says, we get up, and the first thing we do is, pound on the person next to us for being too loud during zazen, and it can boil over. So when we're caught up in that stuff, I think it's difficult for us to remember precepts, right? It's difficult for us to remember the handrails. And it's difficult to remember that we're interconnected, and we just want to, act out. So cultivating both of those things, one hopes we get to equanimity, we get to the ethical living because we've cultivated the ethical living, but the ethical living also helps our zazen. So I think these things are not separate. Doesn't make it easy, right? But, we look at the Eightfold Path and we say, well, it looks like it's a line. We do this and this and this and this. And this. No, these things are arising together, right? We look at the three divisions of the Eightfold Path. These things, the Shila is arising together with everything else. So taking the precepts, or informally or formally, looking to precepts is in a way a set of guidelines for how do we live, and in another way, it's a real support for our zazen, right? For ourselves and others. Doju, do you want to follow up? That was kind of general. Do you have some other things you want to bring up about that?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
Okay, Hoshin has his
I
hand up.
want to say something that relates, I want to say something that I've pulled up here that relates directly to that. Of course, I love that story about the squash. And, you touch the top of your head and all of a sudden, I think that is kind of the metaphor for enlightenment when you realize that. One of Dogen's disciples, Kyogen, who put commentaries in the Brahman Net Sutra. Within this, there was something about I and all beings on the great earth both simultaneously attain enlightenment together. So here we go. But it goes on about the deeper meaning of precept. Precept refers to restraint and extermination. In attaining enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, Shakyamuni Buddha fruited the precepts. This is named restraint. It means to adjust and come to a stop in the truth that I and all beings on the great earth both simultaneously attain enlightenment together. This is precept, which my teacher has never taught, nor has ever the Buddha taught, which I think is a really good way to wind that up. So it's kind of like Dharma, we have the Dharma within us and we realize the Dharma, we feel it, but do we act on it? Do we realize that there's the Dharma, we can create restraint around that? So this is where this kind of goes for me, the deeper meaning of precept.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Doju began by saying something important, which was his reference to the early Sangha and the early practice,
Right.
where, practice was a bit different and it was a bit more linear. So you followed precepts in order to, there was a lot in there about you want to detach from kind of the distraction of senses so that you can do your sitting. So for us, it's kind of together in a different kind of way. So what he said in the beginning was important. So if you're reading the Pali Canon, it's going to say something a little different perhaps than what Dogen says because, the practice was understood a little bit differently. So I think that was part of the reason for your question. Early teachings will say something a little bit different. It's a little bit more linear. Somebody else like to say something? Carla, remember to unmute so we can hear you.
Yep. Hi there. Morning. I wanted to, so when I practice with this poison, I'm always conscious of sort of sometimes it's translated as hatred. Mm-hmm. And I see, and there's like a real difference to me between anger and hatred. You know what I mean? Like anger, usually you can find a source for it, whereas hatred is more irrational. You know what I mean? Like there's this irrational, maybe it's an irrational level of hatred. I don't know. But they seem to be really, really different. And I just would like to hear you comment on that because depending on when I'm reading things and the three poisons come up, sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's hatred. And these really bring up entirely different scenarios in my mind. Whereas from the Pali Canon, I think it's more obviously like the stories are more anger. You have people bickering, that's more anger, not so much hatred, But anyway, I'd like to hear you comment on that because I find the more irrational aspect of that poison to be something more difficult to approach.
Mm-hmm. So I think so the way what comes up for me when I hear that is it feels like a difference between something which is a bit shorter term and something which is a bit longer term. So anger might be, I'm angry at my friend today because of what she said. Hatred might be, I have a long-term perception of a certain group of people, which may or may not be accurate, and I feel threatened by them in some way. It feels a bit longer term. So if I have an argument with my friend that doesn't feel like hatred to me, that says I still love you, but I'm angry at you, and I think we've all had that happen. Whereas hatred to me feels more like there's this long-term something, which makes me, and all this, typically comes down to I feel threatened in some way. People live in some way I find uncomfortable, or they believe something I don't believe, or they act in a certain way, or whatever that is, So there's some kind of long-term, bigger hatred. And it also feels a bit less personal to me, because it doesn't feel like I have hatred toward one human. I could, but when that comes up, it feels much more like there's a group, and I'm generalizing about the group, and I think they are a certain way, and I think that that's never going to change, and I have some really fixed ideas, and those ideas make me unhappy, and I'm going to direct. And again, this is about I'm going to not deal with what I'm feeling. I'm going to make my feelings their problem. I'm going to direct that hatred out here and act on it, possibly, in some aggressive way. So to me, that's the difference. But that's just my perception. And anytime we get caught up in the words and the translation, we have a real opportunity to check perceptions. Because we're dealing, as I say, we're dealing with translation. So as you say, sometimes the three poisons are greed, anger, and ignorance. And sometimes it's, clinging and hatred and delusion. It's like pick your word. So I try not to get too caught up in the English, if I can. But I think you're making a useful distinction, and I think the important point is there are different flavors of suffering. There are different flavors of this impulse to separate. They're personal and not personal, they're short-term and long-term, they're, individual, they're groups, they're about generalizing. But all of that separation tends to be there's something in my life I don't want. And we know, for the basic kinds of suffering, I have something I don't want, I want something I don't have, I feel that what I have is going away. I mean, it's this basic kind of craving and aversion. So I think if it all comes back to aversion, hatred is one kind of aversion, anger is one kind of aversion, there are subtleties in there. So I think what you're raising is important in that it encourages us to look carefully at what's the flavor of aversion that's rising. Whether I give it a name or not, it's like, what's the flavor of aversion that's rising here? Because I don't think they're all the same. Do you want to follow up? Is there something else you want to say about that?
No, thank you. I like that phrase, flavor of aversion, and I'll not order that one at the ice cream parlor. So
very good. Very good. Sagan, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. Maybe it's like thinking of there are different kinds of poisons. Some poisons are much more harmful than others, huh? Or have more of an effect than others. Huh?
Yeah, not only the poison, but the amount.
Yeah.
We take a little bit of a sleeping draft and we sleep well at night because we have a headache. We take too much of that, we don't wake up. It's like, how much of this are we going to imbibe? How deeply enmeshed are we going to get in our anger about one person, and is that going to spread in some way, right? So, we get to look carefully at all of that because there's so much subtlety. And again, entering into it does not mean I feed it, I cling to it, I fan those flames. It means I fully experience it so that I get intimate with it and I understand it and I see it clearly in all its permutations. Right? So it's not about I'm going to cling to it and make it worse, which can be, we can read those teachings in that way. It's like, we got to be careful. So as Doju says, we don't get up off the cushion and bop the person next to us for snoring. Other comments, questions this morning? Hennesis has his hand up.
Hi, I have two questions, if you don't mind that. The first question was kind of like thoughts on the first person who asked something, but basically when it came to like anger in relation to like injustice, I remember coming across this concept, and I've tried to look into it more, but like 90% of the sources I find are Vajrayana related. So I was wondering if there's anything in our tradition that talks about this, but I see a lot of people translate it into English as wrathful compassion. And it's often like personified by wrathful like gods, like Dharmapalas. And I know that Manjushri sometimes is depicted similarly with like a sword for like cutting through various things, and sometimes serves as a protector, like cosmic bodhisattva. So I'm wondering if there's like many Zen teachings related to this concept, as my first question.
Okay, well, Sagan and Doju help me out here. I totally know what you're talking about, things that are coming from the Vajrayana tradition. And I think identifying Manjushri is a useful thing because that image, we see him carrying a sword and he's cutting through delusion. So it is a way of doing something which seems kind of violent. He's cutting through delusion, but he's doing it so that he's doing it with compassion, so that people wake up, right? I think we see that. So there's not a text I'm going to particularly point to in the Zen tradition, but I do think we see it in contemporary times, or again, people who are engaged with social change from a Dharma perspective. There is this feeling of I'm angry on behalf of all beings. I'm working for social change on behalf of all beings, and there's some powerful energy that comes from that, and it's subtle, right? So we have to be careful. How much of this is our ego, and how much of this is on behalf of all beings. Doju and Sagan, can you point to any particular text or anything you particularly can think of that's helpful here?
I was just thinking of, I can't remember the details of it, but I remember Hojo-san saying, I think it was either like Menzan or Manzan, one of those guys, that said something about using the 3 poisonous minds in our practice, like having greed for the Dharma, having anger at ignorance, and being like ignorant of ignorance or something like that. I can't remember how it worked exactly. But you do hear that kind of thing in our tradition. But I think generally speaking, this like notion of using sort of like the opposite kind of thing to achieve the opposite is more like associated with esoteric Buddhism, like Tibetan Buddhism, like, kind of interconnection through like sexual stuff and things like that. You see more in the esoteric traditions.
See, it's good to have a current scholar in our midst. Sagan, did your hand go up too?
Yeah, I remember reading something along the lines that, in a sense, in a certain way, we use the poisons to sort of transform them into wisdom, or in the same way that we might take ice and make water out of it.
Yeah. So thank you. I think both of those are helpful. So in essence, we're using the poisons to transcend the poisons. Can we turn those poisons into medicine? And there are writings about that. I can't they don't come to mind immediately, but I know there are writings about turning those poisons into medicine. So can we make good use of that energy as opposed to harmful use where we turn it inside and kind of struggle with it? Can we instead turn that energy out for good? So it doesn't get talked about exactly the same way as it does in a Tibetan or Vajrayana tradition, but I think those teachings are not unfamiliar. Did you want to follow up or go to your second question?
I think that's satisfactory, and I'll look up Menzan, and like just to follow up on that. But my second question, and this is, I guess, more language related, but I know that in you mentioned before, like the idea of a schism in the Sangha, is often seen as like one of the greatest ways of one of the worst karmas that you could build or something like that. And I've always kind of interpreted that in I guess a historical sense of like schisms between denominations of Christianity. But given that it was brought into a case of like quarreling between monks and something like that, I'm wondering if when that word was used, it's more just talking about like quarreling in general or something like that, and if I should be a bit more loose with how I think of that word. That was my question.
Yeah, and I have to say I don't know what the original Sanskrit was or the teaching around that, so I can't actually say. I mean, I guess I've always seen it translated as schism, and I think the point of that translation is it's a break actually in the community as opposed to a personal disagreement between two people. I think it's simply making that distinction. So I don't know that we're talking about formal schism like half that group is going to go off and found another religion. I think the distinction being made is now we're drawing a lot of people into this quarrel, and it's actually sort of drawing a line down the middle of the Sangha, and people are taking sides, and it's that kind of thing, as opposed to I'm arguing with you, and that's as far as that thing goes. So I guess I would hold that word a bit loosely, but it might be you could do some research into that and find out. I have to say I don't know. Doju, do you happen to know because you've been doing some studying?
I just looked it up actually, and the term in Sanskrit is Sangha Beda, and Beda apparently just means like split. So I think the word schism has some like particular religious baggage in kind of Western usage. So I think maybe thinking of it as like a split in the Sangha might be more general in the way that it was intended. So
kind of like causing a scandal instead of just a small quarrel, you extend it to the rest of the community and like making everyone take sides is kind of the idea here.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's more the sense of sowing division in a community, as opposed to just like Hoko was saying, an individual argument. I don't think it has the sense of like denominations or organizational structure so much as the English word schism does. But
Good, thank you for that. Sagan.
I think isn't the example at the time of the Buddha was Devadatta. I think that problem, where he sort of kind of collected a number of people who were wanting to leave Shakyamuni Sangha.
So there's lots we can look up, read, and talk about related to this, which is interesting. It's interesting, isn't it? Well, I mean, it just goes to show, what's happening at any given time has happened before. This is the human condition. We form communities and we break up communities, and the human dynamic is the human dynamic. So it just kind of reinforces to me that what the Buddha's talking about is still relevant, because he's talking about humans. What do? We create arguments, and then people want to take sides. I think it's not a coincidence that Buddha's even telling us how do we take sides in an argument. Who's working for the Dharma? Because these things are going to happen. So thank you for that clarification. It's good to have others here who teach. Other things people would like to say or ask this morning? Everyone good for the moment? Okay. All right. I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin for our closing chant. Thanks for a good discussion. It's good to see everybody again. Please stay safe and well. We will see you next time.